Give a couple more minutes to let the rest of folks trickle in, and then we'll get started. Thank you for your patience. It almost never fails. And in a situation like this, the garbage man decides to come and make a big racket outside your house when you're on Zoom. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming today. If more folks come, they can trickle in and catch up. But we're very happy to have you join us for this event. My name is Jeff Kubiak. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor of practice in the Center on the Future of War, and I co-direct the center's MA in Global Security. This event today is actually originated as an MA in Global Security event, as we try to engage our stellar faculty in these sorts of events as the year progresses. So for today's event, what we're going to do is Peter's going to talk for 20 or so minutes, and then we'll do questions and answers. Because of the webinar format, the best and maybe only way to do this that I'm going to do this is to use the Q&A block. So at any point in time, if you've got a question for Peter, go ahead and type it in the question and answer block. I'll moderate the question and answer session afterwards. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Center on the Future of War, it is one of the ASU innovations that's connecting the largest public research university, ASU, to a policy-forward think tank in Washington, D.C. called New America. And as you may or may not know, Peter co-directs the Center on the Future of War and is vice president of New America as well. So Peter is obviously a journalist, a documentary producer, vice president for global studies and fellows at New America. He's a CNN national security analyst. And most importantly to me, he's a professor of practice here at Arizona State University, where he teaches a course on war, terrorism and insurgency, as he also co-directs the Center on the Future of War. He's the author or editor of 10 books, 3 of which are New York Times bestsellers, and 4 of which were named among the best nonfiction books of the year by the Washington Post. The books have been translated into 24 languages. Documentaries based on his books have been nominated for 2 Emmys and won an Emmy for Best Documentary. We're really fortunate to have Peter here, especially on this topic of OIF, or that Operation Iraqi Freedom 20 years on. There are a lot of takes going on all over Twitter sphere and the rest of the media outlets about the Iraq war. I'm really interested, Peter, to hear your take on this, as you are very well connected and deeply into this for the last 20 years. Welcome, and thank you for taking the time to do this.
Jeff, thank you. Thank you, Heather, also for arranging, helping to make this happen. And well, thank you for tuning in. I was just in Iraq last week. It wasn't an extensive trip, but I was in Sulaymaniyah in Iraq, which is in Kurdistan. Every year, during COVID, this didn't happen, but the American University of Sulaymaniyah, which is a kind of key university in Iraq, hosts a yearly forum called the Suli Forum. Pretty much every important Iraqi politician is there. I attended the forum and kind of listened into what people were saying. And my takeaway, overall, Iraq today, based on what I was hearing from Iraqis and the various panelists, was, they have a new government, they have a new prime minister. It took them 13 months to get there. Politics remains a former Al Jazeera correspondent in Baghdad, who's now the PBS NewsHour correspondent, Simona Fulton. She's termed Iraqi politics. She talks about the militarization of politics, which is kind of an interesting idea, because every ethnic and religious group has these kind of militias which are backing up particular elected politicians. So that is not necessarily a good thing, obviously. There's also endemic corruption. Iraq sits on the 3rd largest oil reserves in the world. Iraq should be a very, very rich country, but it isn't. And clearly this endemic corruption is a problem. And obviously they've had, in the last 20 years, they've had a lot of things go wrong, not least the Iraqi civil war, the introduction of Al-Qaeda into Iraq, which then became ISIS. you know, each of these events, you know, have the combination of these events have killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. More than 4,500 American service personnel were killed during the Iraq War. It's worth remembering that the United States still has 2,500 troops in Iraq. And I think that is quite important. You know, from a military point of view, it's probably not decisive, but it's worth recalling that then Vice President Biden and his national security advisor, Tony Blinken, negotiated the full withdrawal of US troops from Iraq in December of 2011. And 3 years later, ISIS was like 70 kilometers or 70 miles from Baghdad. And as a result of which, you know, President Obama kind of put American troops back in, and they remain there. And the troops are there in an advisory capacity, and that's important. I mean, the advise and assist mission to the Iraqi military is important. It's also important psychologically. I mean, you look at Afghanistan, where there were also 2,500 troops, and President Biden pulled them all out in the summer of 2021, and look what happened next. So there continues to be a U.S. military presence in Iraq at the invitation of the Iraqi government. And I think that's mostly a good thing. And the Iraqis are, after all, the people who had to deal with the fact that ISIS took over much of Syria and Iraq and controlled territory the size of Great Britain and population the size of Bulgaria. And the fight against ISIS, of course, almost completely destroyed Mosul, which is the second largest city in Iraq. So that's all very recent history. But I came away, you know, from this trip, which was a short trip, but, you know, with some sort of guarded optimism that everybody understands, people in Iraq understand that they need to try and do something about corruption. They need to try and have a more normal politics. Now, you know, on the plus side, you know, Iraq has had several elections and several peaceful transfers of power. It has a relatively free media, not entirely, but certainly a lot more free than its neighbors. And so there are some good things going on, but just to get into the sort of the history here a little bit, since this is about the 20 years since the U.S. invasion. The air war began on March 19th, 2003, and the ground war began on March 20th, 2003. So 20 years ago this past weekend. And on March 26th, then Major General David Petraeus turned to Rick Atkinson, who at the time was a journalist. Now, of course, he's a very distinguished military historian, and asked him a rhetorical question. Tell me, how does this end? You know, and that still remains a really great question today, because, I mean, when General Petraeus asked Rick Atkinson that question, all the history that we now know of what was going to happen in Iraq wasn't that clear. But I mean, Petraeus, as a student of history, he wrote his dissertation on the Vietnam War, understood that, you know, lots of things can go wrong. You know, Machiavelli famously observed that wars begin when you will, but they do not end when you please. And the war in Iraq, no one expected, who voted for this war, you know, what would happen next. And the next involves, you know, a bunch of things that I think we can all collectively wish didn't happen. Al-Qaeda had no presence in Iraq under Saddam. I just did a fairly extensive interview with George Pirro, who was the FBI agent who interrogated Saddam Hussein for 7 months and spent a vast amount of time with him. And, you know, Saddam's view about Al-Qaeda was, I don't trust this guy. I never trust somebody with this really long beard. You know, Saddam was a secularist. He was not, you know, he pretended to be somewhat devout, particularly later in life, but, you know, essentially he was a secular dictator. He was not a religious dictator. And so he was very suspicious of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda had no meaningful presence in Iraq. The Iraq War happened. Al-Qaeda in Iraq became the biggest affiliate of Al-Qaeda and the most powerful, and really basically gave Al-Qaeda a new lease of life. If you think by March 2003, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda in Pakistan had mostly been soundly defeated by US military efforts, and then the Pakistani intelligence services were also arresting members of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. So Al-Qaeda, the Iraq War gave Al-Qaeda a great new lease of life. So that was sort of unexpected consequence number one. Of course, it's greatly ironic because the war was designed to interrupt a supposed alliance between Al-Qaeda and Iraq, which was completely bogus and was based actually in part on the fruits of a coercive interrogation of torture of a guy called Abu Libby, who was picked up and tortured in Egypt, and basically came up with some fairy story about Saddam and Al-Qaeda, which then kind of entered into the intelligence community and ended up in, President Bush's speeches, and it was all nonsense. And, if you knew anything about Saddam or Al-Qaeda, it would have been fairly obvious that they were very unlikely to cooperate. And they didn't, and there was no evidence for that. Now, despite all that, the context here is important for the war. So several months before the war, because Bush and his top officials had constantly been bracketing Saddam and 9/11, it ended up that 2/3 of Americans believed that Saddam was personally involved in the 9/11 attacks, for which there was no evidence. The largest criminal investigation in history was the 9/11 investigation. It involved, I think, 170,000 interviews, chasing down 500,000 leads. It was a massive investigation. And then, of course, you have the 9/11 Commission itself, which was a very thorough congressional investigation of what led up to 9/11. And there's no evidence that Saddam was involved at all. And Saddam and Al-Qaeda, there may have been one meeting in '96 in Khartoum, which nothing came of it between members of Saddam's government and members of Al-Qaeda. But both groups were interested in knowing what the other group was up to, but they had no meaningful partnership or alliance, or didn't cooperate on anything. So, but as a necessary precondition for generating the public support for the war, bracketing 9/11 Saddam was very convenient. So I think that was sort of unintended consequence number one was, and of course, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, it changed its name several times, but by 2014, it was ISIS. Second, I think unintended consequence number two was the rise of sectarianism. Now, sectarianism in the Middle East has been around since Islam essentially, became part of the story of the Middle East, and the splits between the Shia and Sunni have been around for a very long time. But if you think about Baghdad, it was there were plenty of intermarriages between Sunni and Shia. Yes, Saddam was Sunni. Yes, his regime was somewhat dominated by Sunnis. But the United States, by its invasion, flipped the social order so that the Sunnis who'd been on top, who were a minority, were suddenly on the bottom, and the Shia who'd been on the bottom, who were the majority, were suddenly on top. Because if you're going to have a democracy, you're going to elect Shia politicians, because in a democracy, one person, one vote, in a country where the Shia are a substantial majority, they're going to end up with more votes. And I think there was almost virtually no understanding of that when the United States went in. Iraq was sort of a black box, and even though we should be been paying some attention to it since the first Gulf War, but there was very little understanding on the behalf of the people who made these decisions about what was going to happen. And of course, there were terrible decisions made right at the beginning, essentially firing the entire Iraqi military, which was 500,000 men who suddenly had no jobs and very limited skill sets except fighting, who suddenly didn't have pay or pension or benefits. Of course, they were an aggrieved and pissed off group of people. And then getting rid of many of the echelons of the Ba'ath Party, which meant that the professional civil service in Iraq was basically dismantled. So these were two huge errors. And I would add a third one. The United States became an occupying power. And, it might have been, Iraqis probably would have given the United States 6 months to sort things out. And instead they found that, chaos reigned on the streets, and suddenly this is an occupation. And so there were many mistakes made at the beginning. But going back to this question of sectarianism, I think that if you look at the Iraqi civil war, it became entirely sectarian in character, and ripped the country apart, and then it spilled over into Syria, because of course ISIS was to a large degree birthed in Syria. Some of the Sunni jihadist groups that were in Syria were fighting the regime. The regime tried to paint this, this Assad regime tried to paint the war in 2011, 2012 as fighting jihadists. But certainly sectarianism infected the conflict in Syria. And it's also infected conflicts like in Yemen between the Houthis and the pre-existing government. So I would add sectarianism as one of the amplification of sectarianism as another unintended consequence of the invasion. Another big one, and the Russians are playing on this pretty adeptly right now. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was at a conference in India earlier this month, and he said in his remarks that, basically, why are you criticizing us on Ukraine when the United States did something very similar in Iraq? I'm paraphrasing what he said. And of course, there are many differences between the Iraq war and the Ukraine war. George W. Bush toppled a dictator, while Putin is fighting a democratic state in Ukraine. But but there are some similarities that are worth examining and thinking about. One, unlike the US-led war in Afghanistan, which was done under a UN mandate, fairly explicit one, the Iraq war was done without a UN Security Council authorization, and so too was the Ukraine war that Russia has undertaken. So there was not a great deal of international support for either the Iraq war or the war in Ukraine, compared to, say, the US-led war in Afghanistan, which was, of course, the first time that NATO had invoked Article 5, the collective right to self-defense. And I think there were usually about 40 allied countries at any given moment with forces in Afghanistan that went beyond NATO. It included countries, even some Arab states had small presences in Afghanistan during the war against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So there are some similarities. And of course, both of the Iraq war and the Ukraine war were fought not just without international support or a great deal of it, but also they're both fought under false assumptions and with substantial support for these wars domestically because of these false claims. So the Iraq war was really conducted under the banner of Saddam having weapons of mass destruction, which he didn't, and also that he might be give them to terrorists like Al-Qaeda, and he was allied to, which of course he wasn't. And the Ukraine war in Russia is done under the banner of Ukraine doesn't really exist as a country, according to Putin. It should be part of Mother Russia. The Ukrainians that are fighting are actually neo-Nazis, according to Russian propaganda. And as a result of which, according to independent polling in Russia, the war, despite all the costs, which we know, remains quite popular amongst ordinary Russians. This question of preemptive wars, of aggression, wars of choice rather than wars of necessity, I think is also something we should be considering as we think about the legacy of the Iraq War. When I was in, and sort of the counter case is, when I was in Iraq, I visited a museum in Suleimania, which is a former Saddam torture site, an execution site, and that makes for a pretty sobering. It's actually a tourist attraction in Suleimania now. It was set up by the Kurdish government, and it shows, there's a hall of mirrors in the museum with shards of glass which represent each of the 182,000 Kurds that were killed by Saddam during his Anfal campaign in 1988. There are Christmas lights on the ceiling of the museum, 4,500 of them, representing the 4,500 villages that Saddam's men destroyed. And if you take, Human Rights Watch, tends to have a pretty accurate assessments of these. They estimate that as many as 290,000 Iraqis were killed by Saddam in his various campaigns against the Kurds, the Marsh Arabs, and others. And then he also instigated 2 wars of aggression himself, one against Iran that went on for 8 years and killed, conservative estimates suggest, 500,000 people. And then, of course, the 1990 war in Kuwait. So, if you look at Saddam's track record, and you certainly get a sense of that in this museum, where they show how people were electrocuted and how they were beaten on their feet, and these tiny cells were crammed with prisoners sharing overflowing toilets. And this prison is, by the way, in a very kind of quiet, nice residential neighborhood in Sulaymaniyah, which was really the point. Saddam wanted to let people know that, if you opposed him, this was your fate. And he also wanted to let people know, if you're even thinking of opposing me, this could be your fate. And one museum official told me that there was a juvenile part of the prison, and they would change people's ages from 15 to 18 so they could be legally executed at this place. So Saddam was one of the worst tyrants of the 20th century. He's got a fair amount of competition. Stalin, Mao, and Hitler, obviously, they inflicted more misery than he did. However, that said, he certainly was one of the worst of the late 20th century. And so when you sort of trying to do an assessment of, was it all worth it, certainly that's something we need to think about. But then on the other hand, the civil war that followed killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. And under Saddam, Saddam had kind of kept a lid on these sectarian and ethnic tensions, through sheer brutality, but they really surfaced after the U.S. invasion. And Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan, which is one of the great works of political philosophy. He wrote it in 1651, at the very end of the English Civil War that had torn England apart. And his message in the book is basically, the only thing worse than a despot is civil war and anarchy. And he famously said that life in a sort of war, in a country at war with itself is nasty, brutal, and short. And so we seem to have an important lesson of all this. And I'm not making an apology for authoritarian regimes, but be careful for what you wish for, because when you knock over a despot, you may end up with something worse. And then, interestingly, the United States, the United States government tends not to really, often doesn't learn from its own history. And we saw, in the Iraq War, George W. Bush knocked over Saddam in 3 weeks, and toppled his regime. And everybody listening to this knows what happens next. And then 8 years later, President Barack Obama authorized an operation. It didn't have U.S. ground troops in any meaningful number, but it was a U.S.-led NATO operation to get rid of Gaddafi. And Libya is still in a civil war now, 12 years later. And in fact, the civil war there's two governments. There are multiple different proxy forces. The Turks are in there, the Russians are in there, the Qataris are in there, the Emiratis are in there. The French have played a role. The United States played a role during the anti-ISIS campaign in Libya. A bunch of countries have sort of had various kinds of proxy forces in Libya. And so, the message, the lesson that we should learn is that overthrowing a regime may be pretty easy for the United States, particularly a regime like Saddam's or a regime like Gaddafi's. But the day after needs some planning and some thought, and you may end up in a situation that's actually even worse than the terrible situation under the dictator. Just some other points while I'm sort of thinking about it. Oh, yeah, this is an important one. So Joel Rayburn, who's actually a fellow at New America, where I also work, as well as at ASU. Joel was the lead pen on the official Army history of the Iraq War, which is likely to be the only official history of the Iraq War in the United States, which is kind of an astonishing fact. Unlike in Britain, where the Chilcot inquiry was a really deep governmental inquiry into the Iraq War, how it happened, how did the British get involved, et cetera, which generated a 6,000-page kind of report. The U.S. government has not, as a whole, looked at the Iraq War and said what went right and what went wrong. And of course, part of the reason for that is, it's not as politicized as it was, a few years back, but it's a very politicized question. But anyway, the U.S. official history by the Army, which obviously didn't take into account as much of the intelligence issues and the political issues, although it does talk about them to some degree. But their conclusion was that Iran was the main winner of the Iraq War, which is a very interesting and also one of the unexpected kind of outgrowths of all this. Now, of course, Iran has some reasonable right to be involved in Iraq in the sense that Iran is next door to Iraq. The key Shia pilgrimage places of Najaf and Karbala are in Iraq, and millions of Iranians go on pilgrimages every year to these religious sites. So some Iranian influence in Iraq is not to be unexpected. The question is how much? And that's one of the big questions, in Iraqi politics today. You have Iraqi nationalists like Muqtada al-Sadr, who's a Shia cleric who has sort of tried to form a more sort of Iraqi nationalist and anti-Iran kind of form of politics. And then you have other Shia militias, which have quite a lot of influence in Iraqi politics and have somewhat close relationships with Iran. But anyway, certainly no one went into the Iraq War thinking that Iran would be the main winner, which is not, Noam Chomsky talking. That's the official kind of conclusion of the US military in Iraq. I think also, we look at the lack of faith in our own government, and then we also look at how Trump was able to play on, that the US intelligence community is often wrong. I think some of that came from the Iraq War. I mean, there are a bunch of reasons for distrust in the government, but I think the Iraq War was sold to the American people on the basis of claims that turned out to be false, and I think that has contributed to the feeling that a lot of Americans don't trust what the government is saying. So I would add that as another consequence. And then finally, just to end on a slightly more optimistic note, if Iraq is able to kind of get a handle on corruption, if the Iraqi political class, realizes that this is kind of an existential question, you will have more international companies investing in Iraq. I was also in Doha just before going to Iraq, and look, this is one of the richest countries in the world because it sits on, together with Iran, one of the largest gas reserves in the world. Now, Qatar is a small country compared to Iraq in terms of population and size, but that said, Iraq could have a pretty bright future if it gets a hold of the corruption issue, if politics becomes less militarized. And certainly, there's a big issue in Iraq right now, which is kind of a good thing potentially, which is Iraq has a very young population. And so, a very substantial percentage of the population doesn't even remember who Saddam wasn't alive when he was around, or were babies or children. And the whole kind of shadow that Saddam has cast over Iraqi politics, I think, is beginning to lift, because really they need to think about the future, not the past. So, Jeff, with that, I will take any questions.
Great. Thanks, Peter. That's fantastic. And I think I'm going to I have some questions actually that I really would like you to explore and help explain, but I'm going to go actually with the one question in the question and answer box from one of the audience members, because it stays on the theme a little bit that you ended on, and that is the individual wants you to do a thought experiment. What do you think the Iraq and in the region to some degree, what it would look like had the U.S. not invaded in 2003? Do the counterfactual is a good thought experiment, maybe some lessons learned.
Well, so that's a great question. And would there have been an Arab Spring in Iraq? There would have, because obviously the best way for people to get rid of, the best thing that could have happened is if the Saddam had been taken out by the Iraqis, not by the United States. That would have been a better outcome potentially. So, of course, there was an Arab Spring which took out military dictators in Egypt and Tunisia and Yemen. So, it's not out of the question. On the other hand, Saddam had a 91 uprising, and his response was so brutal that it completely destroyed any kind of potential opposition. So it's a big what if. But if Saddam had remained there, would an Arab Spring have swept through Iraq? Might that have led to the overthrow of Saddam? Big maybe. We don't know.
So in addition to the potential catalyst that the war might have created for the Arab Spring, and in addition to the fact that The U.S. Army has concluded that Iran was the big winner. What other features, when the war was started, there were people in the administration who thought they were going to create basically a democratic domino theory in the Middle East. They needed to break the structure of repression in the Middle East, and they were going to do it with a democratic Iraq. Based on the fact that that did not happen explicitly, how would you characterize the impact of the war on the region as a whole?
I think to amplify the Iran point, Iran now has a crescent of influence that goes from Iran to Lebanon, and it goes, through Iraq, up through Syria, and into Lebanon. And of course, it extends to Yemen. And I think the Iraq war greatly hastened that. So that's the biggest important change in the region. And I just want to table as something because Jeff, which is, the big news in the region was China's brokering of this deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which has a big impact on Iraq and also the region. But so I think Iranian influence across the region, that's a big, that's it's not just in Iraq. It look at what happened in Syria, look at what happened in Yemen. The great irony of Mohammed bin Salman's war in Saudi Arabia is that it was designed to kind of, destroy the Houthis, which were sort of Iran, had some connection to Iran. Well, the Houthis are not destroyed, and they're much more strongly aligned with Iran today than they were when Mohammed bin Salman ordered the invasion of Yemen in 2015, when he was Minister of Defense. So, Iran is the big winner. There's no doubt about it. And of course, the other thing, is, and it relates to the China thing, is the limits of American power were pretty well underlined by the Iraq War. And meanwhile, China was building up influence in the region. And now, that influence in the Middle East has always been economic. But now we saw with this diplomatic agreement brokered by China between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that they're also moving into politics in the region. And that was kind of the big story while I was in Middle East was, what does this all mean? I mean, it could be a good thing. Iran has been supplying the Houthi rebels in Yemen with surface-to-air missiles and drones, armed drones, which have been shooting up oil facilities in Saudi Arabia and attacking targets in the Emirates. That it would be great if that stopped. And of course, the Yemen civil war has sort of been subsiding. But if Iran and Saudi Arabia really have diplomatic relations and can kind of come to an agreement, the Yemeni civil war could, really be stopped. And then, there have been proxy wars of various kinds between Iran and the Saudis for a long time. Some of them are hot wars like Yemen. Some of them are medium wars like Iraq, and some of them are cold wars like Lebanon. But in countries across the Middle East, these are the two big regional players, other than the United States and now the Chinese. And if anything to reduce those tensions is kind of on a global basis, that's a good thing. What does it mean? I think when historians look at 2023, they may say the French and the British basically controlled the Middle East more or less after World War I. The Americans more or less controlled the Middle East. And when I say control, I mean, obviously the individual countries had, their own sovereignty, but like the main player was the United States. 2023 may be the moment when historians 50 years from now say, well, that was the beginning of the Chinese really having a really big role, and the United States sort of seen as just less important.
That's interesting. Actually, one of the audience members asked the question too: what would happen if the U.S. became less visibly involved in the Middle East and resembled more of the interaction of the Europeans in the region? And perhaps gave way to the Chinese and some stuff. I know you're not feeling well. I appreciate you doing this. This has got to be a little bit of a struggle.
I think look, we pulled out of Afghanistan. We're no longer a player there. I mean, you're either in or you're out. I mean, and so if you're out, our ability to influence what happens in Afghanistan or Pakistan is. I always thought it was very strange when President Biden, when he justified the pullout from Afghanistan, said, we got to worry about great power competition. Well, look, Bagram Air Force Base, and you're a former Air Force colonel, right? It was probably one of the best. If you're interested in power projection against the Chinese, the Russians, and Iran, all of which have all countries bordering the former Soviet Union borders Afghanistan, China borders Afghanistan, Iran borders Afghanistan. Bagram Air Force Base was a perfect place for power projection in a great power competition. And we, if we're absent, we're absent. I mean, it's like you're just, I think if we pull that, one thing I said when I was in Iraq is like, in 2024, you might have a President DeSantis or President Trump or whatever. Like these 2,500 troops, it's not a large number, but it's psychologically important because it means the United States is still engaged. And if we pull them, then we're not engaged. And, we're there at the invitation of the Iraqi government. It's not an occupation force. It's a train and advise and assist mission. And, I think it's important that we remain there if we want to be influential there. If our goal is simply to be, have some sort of isolationist, Fortress America approach where we just we're not involved in the world, fine. I mean, that's a political decision. It's not one I particularly endorse because I feel like the absence of American. We've run this tape so many times, Jeff. By the way, let's take Afghanistan. In 1989, when the Soviets basically withdrew, pretty much defeated, we closed our embassy in Kabul and then zeroed out aid to one of the poorest countries in the world and basically washed our hands. Well, guess what? Into the vacuum comes the Taliban and Al Qaeda and everything we know that follows. And sort of absenting ourselves from situations doesn't bring world peace, which I think in some people's mind is like if we're not there interfering, whatever they used to use, that somehow things will be better. Well, I don't think that's true necessarily.
Yeah, that's a good point. As a strategist, I would think too that you may not be in a position of strength or have the upper hand in any given situation, but as long as you're still a player, things can change and move to your advantage, and then you're there to take advantage of that advantage when it shows up. If you're not there, you're going to miss every opportunity that shows up. One of the things that I got a couple more questions in the question and answer, but I want to throw a question at you because I like to think a little bit historically too, and try to get out of our presentism, if you will, of 2023. So 5 years after 2003 invasion was 2008, right? Spring of 2008, the surges started taking effect. We started seeing the civil war start to just kind of fade just a little bit. It actually became less of a issue in the 2008 presidential campaign that year. All eyes turned to Afghanistan at that point in time. So at that point, if somebody to say the view of the Iraq War, you would have one view of it, and it seemed like, okay, well, we kind of screwed things up, but we fixed it. 10 years on, and maybe that's a poor characterization, you can certainly challenge me on that. 10 years on, 2013, ISIS is gaining strength. Things in Iraq seem to be becoming unglued after our 2011 departure. Things are looking pretty grim at that point in time. All fingers are starting to point blame at people and things where people are not happy. But then 15 years on, in 2018, ISIS is largely flat. And we're kind of been at the status quo since then. So one, is my characterization reasonably good as I think through those different time periods and try to put myself back in that time, because we were both engaged in this business back then, and then project yourself 10 years into the future. What does it look like? Let's go 2023, 2033. Was this worth it?
Well, A, I think your characterizations are right. And B, Yogi Berra famously said it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. And I'm a big Yogi Berra fan on that front. And,
okay.
I think it's just like, it's super hard to say. Look, I mean, who could have predicted that ISIS would take over much of the country, including the second largest city in Iraq? That's where they established their caliphate. If you said that 10 years, if you said that in 2004, it would have been impossible. I mean, I came away with kind of guarded optimism about where Iraq is today, and hopefully that will just sort of continue. And there's probably one prophylactic against having a civil war is having gone through one yourself already relatively recently. And the whole ISIS experience and just understanding we need to be super careful. I think one of the other things that is positive in Iraq, Jeff, is the counterterrorism service, which was stood up when with help from the United States. It's a very professional part of the Iraqi military. You remember the Iraqi military collapsed like a house of cards as ISIS advanced because of corruption and lack of leadership, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now they have the counterterrorism service is a very professional, non-sectarian, and popular and successful part of the Iraqi military. So it's hard to imagine that they would have an internal threat that the counterterrorism service couldn't deal with now. So I think that's another ground for sort of guarded optimism.
So let's stay on the topic of guarded optimism then.
Yeah.
So you talked about the Arab Spring being something, maybe it causes the war being a catalyst for that. And then U.S. interventions in Iraq and Libya, having freed those countries of their tyrant rulers. What's the future of democracy in that region going forward? Is there, I mean, do you still have guarded optimism that there's an evolution of social organization that's going to allow for something that resembles a peaceful democratic state in amongst some of those that have suffered those sorts of revolutions? Imposed or
no, I mean, I don't. Let's just go around the horn. I mean, look, Sisi's Egypt is much worse than Mubarak's Egypt. And Mubarak's Egypt was pretty terrible in terms of, imprisoning tens of thousands of political prisoners and, no independent media, et cetera. And Sisi's even worse. So that, Yemen is still stuck in a terrible, the remnants of a bad civil war. And look, who knows what will happen there. Syria, Assad has sort of more or less won the war. Obviously, his approach to politics is not, should we say, inclusive. In Lebanon, Hezbollah essentially controls the show, and Lebanon as a country, they have Lebanon as a country. I was there about a year ago, and the place is dematerialized between the financial problems that they have, the port. The explosives that blew up in the port and sort of devastated Beirut. It has a form of democratic politics, but is largely, to some degree, dominated by Hezbollah, which is a more efficient military than the Lebanese military, and has a sort of veto power in Lebanese politics to some degree. So I think it really depends on which country you're in. So by those standards, Iraq is certainly doing a lot better. Iran, the mullahs are, we've had the protest movements, but they have no leadership, which is both a strength and a weakness. Means that it's hard for the Iranian authorities to put them down because there's no obvious sort of fulcrum around, but also it's hard for the opposition movement to kind of take over because there's no leadership. And I think the Iranian government is, extremely well entrenched in the sense that they have, the Quds force and the Revolutionary Guards and the Besaji, which are this sort of citizen militia, and it's a very large kind of dictatorial state with a huge amount of police power. So I don't see, Iraq by comparison is doing much better on that front.
All right, so let's focus this maybe inward on us at this point. Looking back at the decision making and intelligence, obviously, that went into the war in Iraq, and then the decision making that went into the regime change efforts that the U.S. and NATO undertook in Libya. Have we learned our lesson about regime change? Are there other opportunities that we might choose to forget the lessons that regime change that the Iraq war has taught us?
Well, it's a bipartisan failure, Iraq and Libya. And so, I hope that we have sort of learned our lesson. Iraq did produce, on the intelligence community side, it did produce a lot of self-examination about, there's a lot more red teaming in the intelligence community. I know having done a book about the hunt for bin Laden, that was red teamed up the wazoo in terms of trying to find alternative explanations for circumstantial cases. So it wasn't, if it wasn't bin Laden living in this compound in Badabad, what were the other explanations? Well, could it be somebody else in Al Qaeda? Could it be a drug dealer? Could it be somebody with just money and trying to keep a low profile? So there's much more. I think when the weapons of mass destruction fiasco was, Saddam played a role. I mentioned interviewing George Pirro, who was the FBI agent who spent 7 months with Saddam. Well, Saddam had disarmed, but he was trying to have it both ways, because his main concern about the world was not the United States, it was Iran. He'd, after all, fought an 8-year war with Iran that mostly, had killed, 500,000 people. It basically ended with a stalemate. And so his main concern was to sort of keep pretending that he had weapons of mass destruction in order to deter the Iranians from attacking Iraq. And he was being too clever by half. So Saddam did contribute to this assessment. And he'd used poison gas and nerve agents against his own people. So he had the weapons of mass destruction case was greatly aided by Saddam's prevarications and statements. But that said, he had disarmed. And so I think, certainly the US government learned from that mistake. The intelligence community certainly learned from that mistake, which is like, we need to have a better process for taking a case and sort of kicking the tires of it, because the CIA did a pretty good job of pushing back on Saddam's links to Al-Qaeda in the run-up to the Iraq war. But they did a pretty bad case. They did not do well on the weapons of mass destruction, because they were actually substantiating the case in one way or another. But it relied on defectors who had an interest in getting rid of Saddam. It relied on people who'd been tortured, the person I mentioned earlier, and the whole case was very, very flimsy, as we know.
One of the audience members wonders if you had read Robert Draper's To Start a War.
I haven't, but I know Robert Draper, and it's supposed to be a great book, and yeah, I mean, I guess, and I don't know if this individual, he didn't put Draper's thesis in there, and I'm not familiar with the book, but he actually wanted to know what you make of Draper's reporting on the Bush administration's decision leading to the war. Really can't comment on it. I haven't read the book, but before, in 2014, I had the opportunity to interview Secretary Powell, kind of about his career in the military, for a documentary my wife and I made for National Geographic called American War Generals. And Powell, super impressive guy, obviously. But I did ask him, just because I was curious, did George W. Bush ever ask you directly what you thought about this war in Iraq? And Powell's answer is no, which is kind of a stunning, the fact that George W. Bush didn't ask Colin Powell directly about his own view about whether this was a good thing is kind of astonishing, because after all, Powell had been instrumental in the very successful first Gulf War. So, at the end of the day, I think, as I read the accounts of how this decision was made, it seems to be like, I'll give you a very clear example based on my own reporting. So, Osama bin Laden was at Tora Bora in eastern Afghanistan on December 12th, 2001. I mean, we know that it's not a speculation now. It's based on eyewitness testimony and various other forms of evidence. So it was that very day that Tommy Franks briefed Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, about the new Iraq war plan. Now, so the Iraq war plan was 800 pages, and Rumsfeld a week earlier had said, we need to refresh it, because they knew the war was coming. And so, Frank, you can imagine, Tommy Franks is probably one of the least successful American generals in history, right? He is very implicated in two very large failures. One, the failure to get bin Laden, and also the Iraq war. He was the commander. But, in his defense, Rumsfeld asked him to basically rewrite an 800 word. You say you're a strategist, Jeff, so it's like, rewrite an entire war plan in a week. So Franks was really kind of preoccupied with that. But I think it goes to where the mindset was. This is it's only 3 months after September 11th. This is not, 3 months before March 2003. It's already clear that this is going to happen. And, we know from lots of reporting that Paul Wolfowitz and others who were in favor of the Iraq war were linking Saddam to the 9/11 attacks on September 12th. And they were talking about it in meetings at the White House, and they were sort of mumbling about it at Camp David, the key Camp David meeting, where basically the plan to attack Afghanistan led by the CIA came up on September 15th, roughly 2001. So anyway, all by way of saying, this decision seemed to have been sort of in some way pre-baked, and it was not. There was never any kind of real debate about it. It just sort of happened.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I was controlled by that. I wrote a chapter of this in my dissertation too, about the war narratives and such, and how the narratives were driven, for the purposes of justifying a war policy in Iraq. And there was so much indication that a lot of it was either fabricated or drawn from really, really thin evidence to create a story that compelled the nation to war. And it's a little bit stunning, not altogether upbeat. Back to the region, though. The last two questions in the block actually have to do with Iran. One member asks, now that the Iran supported coordination framework has a majority in parliament and al-Sudani is the prime minister of Iraq, will we see in Iraq semi-controlled by Iran? And if so, what further ambitions would Iran take using Iraq as a geographic and political platform?
So I don't claim to be an expert on all that, but I mean, I will. It's interesting because I mentioned Muqtada al-Sadr earlier. Back in the day when he was this younger firebrand cleric, he was closely aligned with Iran. And in the recent years, his career is really about being anti-Iran and sort of Iraqi nationalist. So yeah, Iran has a lot of influence in Iraq, some of it completely legitimate. They're neighbors. There's a lot of, the pilgrimages I mentioned, that kind of thing. But, do they control Iraqi politics? I think it's a big debate, and I don't really have a good answer. They certainly are a very big player, but I remember when I first went to Iraq in 2008, Iraqis would sometimes refer to the Iranians as the Persians, and I don't think it was meant as a term of endearment. There's a plenty of suspicion of Iran, and of course, if you're, I know very, very little about Shiism in general, but the great Qom is not like the, Najaf and Karbala are like, at the end of the day, so much of Shiism is really an Iraqi, not an Iranian thing. And the Khomeini revolution kind of grabbed a lot of that. So there's plenty of suspicion of Iran in Iraq. There's plenty of, Iranian influence, and, it's not completely black and white.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's kind of how politics works. One of the audience members, and I definitely agree with this individual, says Mr. Bergen has written several terrific books himself. Can we expect a foreseeable new volume from him soon? Let's talk about your current work.
No, I wish I could say yes, but I can't. I'm actually starting an audio show for Audible about national security and foreign policy, and it's taking up a lot of time. And books take up a lot of time, and so between my ASU commitments and New America and CNN, and something has to give, and right now books have to give, because they take up a lot of, a book, you can never do enough research, you can never get it perfect enough. It takes it sucks up every sort of ounce of oxygen you have, and so no books for a while.
So tell us about the Audible project, though. I'm curious. What can you share?
Yeah, well, it's going to debut May 16th, and it's the idea, it's called the title's In the Room, and the idea is to get inside the room where decisions are made, whether it's the Afghan pullout decision or we're doing a show on Iraq, kind of Iraq 20 years later, which is, it's highly produced. It's not sort of people just yakking at a mic, if you know what I mean. It's more like mini audio documentaries. So that's taking up a lot of time, and that's my main.
So the first debuts in May this year?
May 16th.
May 16th. Excellent. We'll be looking for that. All right, the question and answer block is empty. I have emptied my quiver as well, so appreciate Peter taking the time to do this. This is fantastic. Great discussion about a really important piece of American history and contemporary global security. For those of you who are, first of all, I want to compliment the audience. We had a great audience, and almost all of them stayed the entire time. I appreciate that. I see a lot of not only current MAG students, but MAG's alum in the audience, in addition to our Center of the Future of War team and former students. I see Brianna's here. Good. So it's been a real pleasure to have you, Peter, and we look forward to doing something like this again in the future. Please stay in touch if you want to come study under Peter Bergen and you're not already enrolled in the MA in Global Security. By all means, I hope to see your application soon. Peter, have a nice day. Thank you for your time, and thank you, audience, for participating.
Thank you.